Hi there, and welcome to Positivity, your weekly celebration of all things book related. This week is the start of a new mini series I am trialing called Bookshelf Essentials. Each month, I'm going to pick a theme or category and introduce you to my favourite books related to it. This week, I have picked big books, by which I mean books over 500 pages. To give you some background, I love a fat book. I love books that sprawl across generations and time periods and places. The title that I give a really good fat book is a sprawler. If I were to try and define what this is, I would say it's a book that gives you the sensation of growing alongside the characters, so that by the time you end, you feel almost bereft that you've lost someone you actually know. I've ordered these 6 books from thinnest to fattest, starting with Middlesex by Eugenides. This book is written from the perspective of Cal, an intersex man who is telling us essentially his life story. But what I love about the narration that Eugenides creates is that we aren't simply told just the story of Cal's family. We're told the story of Cal's family through the lens of the genetics that come to form Cal's intersex. I've never read a book quite like this before or since Middlesex. The sensitivity with which Eugenides writes about an experience that in actuality is quite high. Some studies found intersex babies make up about 1.7% of births, but not one often represented in literature, is really profound. There's a question mark running through the centre of this novel that I think everyone can relate to, regardless of whether you are intersex or not. It's around what makes you uniquely you. Is it your nature? Is it your nurture? Is it your upbringing? Is it your genetics? There's a tension around society's desire to label and categorise everyone. Eugenides is exploring what happens when you don't feel as though you fit into any of the categories. My next fattest book is Woof by Hilary Mantel, which I mentioned in a previous video as a recommended read if you enjoyed Rodham. Woof is the first in a trilogy and depicts the relationship between Thomas Cromwell and Henry VIII, particularly how Cromwell advises and in some cases manipulates the monarch. And what fascinates me about Mantel's writing is the way she can make a historical figure like Cromwell, whose reputation is not all that pleasant, into such a charismatic and strangely likeable character while still retaining his cold and callous side. It's also a wonderful delve into Tudor England and all of the politics and conflict going on around Europe at that time. I find religion in the Tudor period absolutely fascinating, especially the religious tensions of that period, which Woof goes into great detail about. The novel picks up with Henry VIII trying to divorce Catherine of Aragon in place of the younger Anne Boleyn. Although this is historical fiction and we ultimately kind of know where it's going, Mantel weaves such a visceral picture of this political landscape that you still become drawn into the emotional action. And the best bit is, if you love Woof, then you have Bring Up the Bodies and The Mirror and the Light to follow up. My next big book, which is only 3 pages fatter than Woof in my edition, is The Corrections by Jonathan Franzen. Now, I know some people are not fans of Franzen. I've heard people call him self-important before, and I have definitely taken issue with some of his female characters. Purity, which I read over Christmas, was really challenging at points in that regard. But The Corrections was one of those books I became so enthralled by I couldn't put it down. It follows the story of a family as they navigate contemporary America. The parents of the family are older, the father has Alzheimer's, and Franzen explores how each of the children and their families deal and process this news. One of the things I remember most vividly about this novel is how unlikable all of the characters are. There are so many selfish and greedy people in this novel, but that doesn't stop it from being a real riot in places. Next up is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. I was introduced to this book by my other half, who absolutely adores it. And while I was sceptical at first, because I'm not normally a fantasy lover, I adored it too. It's the first in the King Killer trilogy, although we're still awaiting the 3rd part, and follows the form of an innkeeper who goes by the name of Coat, telling the story of his youth to a scribe called Chronicler. He goes on to explain his journey to learn the magical discipline of sympathy and avenge the death of his parents and travelling company that he grew up with. It's a real epic story, this one, and although Rothfuss spends a lot of time over what feels like minute detail, it all knits together to form this masterpiece of storytelling. My penultimate fat book is The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton, which won the Booker Prize a few years ago. The Luminaries is set in New Zealand during the Gold Rush, and ever since I read it, I've wanted to travel to New Zealand and explore all of the beautiful, vivid locations that Catton captures in this book. The novel is structured around the 12 signs of the zodiac, and there are 12 sets of characters who represent each sign. There's so much going on in this novel, from sibling relationships to fortune finding, to laudanum trading and subsequent drug addiction. This book was probably the first really fat book that I read and experienced that sprawling sensation with. So my love of this book is partly connected to those associations. But I can assure you that many of my friends who've read this book have also adored it. Finally, the fattest of fat books is 4321 by Paul Auster. This book tells the story of Archie and is a bit of a sliding doors book, if you've watched that film and get the reference. Essentially, it's a book made up of 4 narratives, all concerning the same boy and the same family, but the development of those starting points change depending upon different circumstances and scenarios. It really plays upon that what could have been narrative, but in probably the most developed and detailed way that I've ever seen in a novel. By the end of this book, one narrative has turned him into this family man, academic, one has turned him into an artistic rebel, in another he's gay. The possibilities are just endless, and the family dynamics are endless too. In one, his parents remain happily married, in another, one dies, etc., etc. If I were to read this book again, and at 1,070 pages, with a very chunky paragraphing style, it's a commitment, then I would probably read it in a different order. Auster sections the book into periods of life, but then there are 4 different versions of that period. So the chapters are titled 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, and then 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4, etc., etc. So you could read the book as it's written with each narrative side by side, or you could read 1.1, then 2.1, then 3.1, etc., etc., so that you experience the whole of one lifeline before beginning the next. At 1,040 pages, this book is a real chunker, but it is worth the read. You just have to make sure you've set some time aside. So those are my chunky bookshelf essentials. Let me know what chunky books you've enjoyed in the comments. Thank you for listening. See you soon.